A girl went to a store just a few minutes away from her house, but she never came back. The police started their search, and over the course of the investigation, they uncovered some pretty strange clues. Still, the mystery remained unsolved for decades until the truth came out in a completely unexpected way. Christy Wesselman was born on April 19, 1970 in Glen Ellen, Illinois. She lived there with her mom, two older brothers, and a sister. Their town was considered one of the safest in the area, and Christy loved spending time outside. She'd spend hours wandering the streets with other kids from the neighborhood. At school, Christy was popular and had a lot of friends. She was actively involved in school life and even got elected as vice president of her class. On top of that, she played volleyball and softball. In the summer of 1985, 15-year-old Christy was taking summer classes at school and spent most of her free time hanging out with friends. On July 21st, Christy came home from school around 3:30 p.m. Right after getting home, she decided to walk to a local store to grab a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mom. Her mother expected her back in just a few minutes since the store was close by. But as time went on, it became clear something was wrong, because Christy wasn't coming home. At first, her mom thought she might have run into some friends and gone off with them. Back then, there were no cell phones, so she couldn't check in with Christy and had no choice but to wait. As evening set in, her worry only grew. She called Christy's friends, but none of them had seen her that day. Growing desperate, she headed to the store herself, scanning the streets along the way, but there was no sign of Christy anywhere. Christy's family spent the next several hours searching for her, but when there was still no sign of her by 1:50 a.m., her mother decided to contact the police. Officers quickly joined the search, starting by piecing together Christy's last known movements. First, they spoke with the clerk at the store she'd visited. The man knew Christy well. He lived nearby and had even babysat her when she was younger. He confirmed that Christy had come by around 4 p.m., picked up some chocolate bars, and left. She didn't mention where she was headed, but the clerk noted that she seemed happy and nothing about her behavior struck him as unusual. Police also found a few other witnesses who had seen Christy at the store, but none of them could recall where she went after that. Investigators spoke to all of Christy's friends, considering the possibility that she might have lost track of time while hanging out with some of them. But none of her friends had seen her that day. The police then focused all their resources on the search and began combing through the streets. But by that time, it was already the middle of the night, making the search even more challenging. Despite their determination, there was no trace of Christy. No clues, no leads, nothing. The search continued through the early morning, and by midday, a new group of officers took over. One of them suggested trying to retrace Christy's likely route. He guessed that she had probably taken the shortest path from her house to the store, a shortcut through a nearby field. Back then, there was a large vacant lot with tall grass between the residential area and the store. Walking around it would take quite a bit of time. For adults driving cars, it wasn't an issue, but local kids who frequented the store or the nearby McDonald's always took a shortcut through the field, where a narrow path had been worn into the grass. The detective decided to follow this trail. As he made his way along it, something unusual caught his eye in the grass. Pushing through the overgrowth, he realized it was a human body, and he quickly recognized Christy. He immediately called for backup, and the body was handed over to the medical examiners for further analysis. Forensic specialists combed through the crime scene for any evidence, but their search came up empty. No footprints, no personal belongings, nothing to help explain what had happened. The medical examiners determined that Christy had died from 8 stab wounds. They also found evidence of SA and collected the perpetrator's biological material. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy and not commonly used in criminal investigations. So, with no way to analyze it, the sample was stored for future use. Christy's mother also helped police piece together another interesting detail. Christy had been wearing a pearl ring on her finger that day. However, the ring was nowhere to be found, neither on her body nor at the crime scene. Detectives concluded that the killer might have taken it and instructed all officers to keep an eye on pawn shops in case the murderer tried to sell it. With no physical evidence to work with, the police focused on finding potential witnesses who might have seen Christie or the killer near the field. They managed to track down several people who had used the same path around the estimated time of the murder, but none of them reported seeing anything suspicious. It was quite weird because Christie's body was just a few yards off the trail, although it was hidden by the tall grass, making it nearly impossible to spot. Investigators also learned that just a few dozen yards from where Christie's body was found, a family had been hosting a barbecue in their backyard. But despite being so close to the scene, none of them remembered hearing or seeing anything out of the ordinary. An employee at a gas station about 60 yards from the field also worked his entire shift that day, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. To the police, the situation seemed bizarre. So many people had been near the crime scene, yet no one saw or heard anything. Investigators theorized that the unknown attacker either followed Christie from the store to the field or encountered her on the path. He likely led her just a few yards into the tall grass and killed her, all without making a sound. Detectives considered the possibility that Christie might have known her killer, which could explain why there were no screams. After all, their town was small and many residents knew each other. Police began investigating all the men who knew Christie, but this effort led nowhere. They also compiled a list of men in the area with prior convictions for violent crimes. Several suspects were reviewed, but none of them could be tied to the murder. For several months, the police made little progress in solving the mystery. They continued following up on tips and investigating new suspects, but every lead brought them to a dead end. This dragged on for 3 long years, until an unexpected breakthrough came in 1988. By that time, DNA analysis was becoming a key tool in criminal investigations. Detectives decided to collect DNA samples from everyone who had been a potential suspect in Christie's case over the years. Many agreed to cooperate, and none of their samples matched the biological evidence found at the scene. But there was one person who refused to provide a DNA sample. Dana Henry, a 34-year-old man living near the field where Christie was found, had been on the police's radar from the first days of the investigation. At the time, Henry denied having anything to do with the crime. But now, his refusal to give a sample made detectives seriously question his innocence. The police decided to seek a court order to obtain his DNA. Henry appeared at the court hearing and continued to insist he was innocent. However, he was charged with contempt of court and held in a local jail cell for several days. Only after that, Henry agreed to provide his DNA sample. In the end, his DNA didn't match the killer's sample, and Henry was released. Once he was out, he told reporters that he had been held in a jail cell without clothing and was only released after he gave in to the immense pressure and reluctantly agreed to provide his sample. Henry said he spent around $50,000 on legal fees, a significant amount of money at the time. He had to mortgage his home, which he eventually lost, and many of his friends and family turned their backs on him. Frustrated and angry, Henry filed a lawsuit against the police department, but it didn't seem to lead anywhere. Even after DNA evidence cleared his name, some people still believed he was guilty. Years later, Henry admitted to reporters that the whole ordeal had ruined his life, even though he was never formally charged with a crime. For another year, Christie's case remained at a standstill, until 1989, when an unexpected twist brought it back into the spotlight. A judge issued a restraining order against a local man who had been bombarding the victim's family with tips about who he believed was responsible for Christie's murder. The man, named Willis, first contacted Christie's relatives in late 1985. He claimed to have information about the killer's identity and started sending them various leads. Each tip was investigated by the police, but every time it turned out to be either far-fetched or completely irrelevant to the case. This dragged on for almost 4 years, until Christie's family couldn't take it anymore. They filed a complaint, and a judge issued an order barring Willis from ever contacting them again. Following the restraining order, police decided to investigate Willis himself, but they found no evidence linking him to the crime. In 2000, the killer's DNA was uploaded to the FBI database, but no matches were found. The case remained cold for many years. From time to time, the police revisited it, following up on tips, but they never got any closer to catching the killer. This went on for 3 entire decades. Over the years, the original detectives had all retired or moved on, and Christie's case had been assigned to a new team. Then, in 2015, something completely unexpected happened. One day, they got a notification from the FBI database. The DNA sample from Christie's killer perfectly matched a recently uploaded profile. The DNA belonged to a 62-year-old man named Michael Jones, who lived in a small town called Champaign, about 150 miles from Christie's home. Jones's DNA was added to the database after he was arrested for domestic violence. His wife had reported him to the police, which led to his arrest. According to an Illinois law passed in 2002, anyone suspected of a crime has to provide a DNA sample. Interestingly, the main advocate for this law was the state's attorney from the same county where Christie's murder took place, and this particular unsolved case had been a major factor in his push to get this legislation passed. As soon as the DNA match came through, investigators jumped into action, looking into Michael Jones. The first thing that stood out was that his name had never been mentioned in the case before. He wasn't a suspect, a witness, or even someone remotely connected to the investigation. The detectives simply hadn't known he existed. Michael Jones had a long criminal history. His first run-in with the law came in the mid-70s when he assaulted a woman. But for some unknown reason, he apparently avoided any real consequences. Just a year later, Jones attacked a 27-year-old woman, assaulted her, and left her in a hospital parking lot. When police issued a warrant for his arrest, Michael turned himself in. During his trial, he expressed deep regret for his actions and claimed he had a great respect for the law. That's why he surrendered voluntarily. Jones also insisted that he suffered from serious mental health issues and needed professional help. However, an independent psychiatrist determined that he was fully aware of his actions. As a result, Jones was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. As you might have guessed, Michael was released early for good behavior. He ended up serving just 6 years of his sentence and was back on the streets by 1983, 2 years before Christie's murder. What's even more striking is that his victim wasn't informed of his early release. Later, she stated that had she known, she would have done everything in her power to challenge the decision. A year after his release, Michael got married, but in 1994, his first wife left him and secured a restraining order against him. The reason? He had been showing an unhealthy interest in one of her young relatives. But despite this alarming behavior, no formal charges were ever filed. In 1999, Michael was arrested again, this time for assaulting a family member of his new girlfriend. Detectives also learned that Michael often went on long solo motorcycle trips and frequently visited relatives in Chicago. Given that Christie's town was on the outskirts of his route, it's possible he passed through the area while traveling to see his family. If that was the case, it would explain why he never appeared on the detective's radar. If Michael was just passing through for a few hours, tracking his presence would have been nearly impossible. Christie's mother said she had never heard his name before. When police first called her to ask about Michael, she didn't think much of it. Over the past 30 years, investigators had contacted her many times with questions, so this just felt like another routine inquiry. But everything changed when police obtained a fresh DNA sample from Michael while he was in prison and confirmed once and for all that he was the killer. They visited Christie's mother in person to deliver the news. After all these years, the man responsible for her daughter's murder had finally been caught. Before formally charging Michael with Christie's murder, detectives spoke with his ex-girlfriend and uncovered more details about him. She described Michael as someone with a volatile temperament. He could be calm one moment and then suddenly fly into a rage for no apparent reason. She also mentioned that he was obsessed with detective books and crime shows on TV. This information led investigators to suspect that Michael might not just be responsible for Christie's murder, but potentially other unsolved crimes as well. His frequent solo trips, criminal tendencies, and fascination with crime stories hinted that he might have known how to cover his tracks and avoid leaving evidence behind. After building their case against Michael, police officially charged him on September 18, 2015, and Michael denied any involvement in Christie's murder. The case eventually went to court, but the wait dragged on for 3 long years. The trial didn't start until 2018. Prosecutors sought a life sentence, but in the end, Michael decided to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to reveal any details about the crime, but with the DNA evidence, there was no question about his guilt. As a result, the judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 2095. In other words, Michael will likely never walk free again. Christie's family thanked the investigators for finally bringing the case to a close. Christie's mother also expressed her frustration over Michael's early release in 1983. She pointed out that if he had served his full 10-year sentence, he wouldn't have had the chance to attack her daughter, and Christie would still be alive today. Henry, the man initially suspected of the crime, also attended the trial of the real killer. In a later interview, he shared that the accusations had ruined his life, and even decades later, he still hadn't fully recovered. He hoped that seeing justice served would help him heal, but it didn't. Henry also revealed that throughout all these years, no one from the police department ever apologized to him, let alone faced any consequences for the damage they had caused to his life. Caitlin Markham was born on August 16, 1989, in Fairfield, Ohio. She grew up in a loving family with her parents and younger sister and was surrounded by many friends. Even as a child, Caitlin had a gift for making connections. She could approach the shyest kids on the playground and have them laughing and playing with her in no time. Caitlin was also a creative soul who loved singing, drawing, and basically anything related to art. Her passion shaped her career path, and after high school, she enrolled in a local university to study graphic design. The summer of 2011 was supposed to be a turning point in Caitlin's life. She was preparing for her final exams and planning a big move to Colorado with her fiancé, John. The couple had been together for 6 years and got engaged the year before. They dreamed of starting their life together in a new city and were looking forward to getting married after the move. On the morning of August 14th, Caitlin was supposed to go to her shift at the bridal shop where she worked part-time. That day, her loved ones tried reaching out to her, but she didn't respond to any calls or messages. Soon, her family began to worry and contacted Caitlin's workplace, only to find out that she hadn't shown up for her shift that morning. This was highly unusual. Caitlin was always in touch and had never missed work without letting someone know. Still, her family initially thought she might be busy with someone else and couldn't get back to them. They decided to wait it out, but as evening approached and there was still no word from Caitlin, their concern grew to a breaking point. Her fiancé, John, decided to stop by her apartment after work to check if everything was okay. Caitlin's car was parked in front of the small apartment complex where she lived, but when John entered the apartment, which was unlocked, he only found her dog inside. There was no sign of Caitlin, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary to suggest that something bad had happened. Despite this, the fact that she hadn't been in touch all day was deeply concerning to everyone who knew her, so John decided to call the police. He explained that his fiancée hadn't been in contact since the morning, and they sent a patrol officer. After searching Caitlin's apartment, the officer found no signs of a break-in, struggle, or anything to indicate a crime. But one particular thing did stand out as suspicious. Caitlin's keys were inside, along with her wallet and ID. Given that she wasn't at home, this raised red flags for the officer. If Caitlin had left on her own, she would have at least taken her keys and locked the door behind her. John said that he last saw Caitlin the night before. They had been hanging out at her place with a mutual friend. After his friend left, John headed to a party with some other friends, while Caitlin decided to stay home because it was already late. A few hours later, John returned to his own home, where he lived with his mom. He and Caitlin exchanged a few messages, but after that, she stopped replying. John mentioned that he texted her every morning and always got a response, except this time. Investigators spoke with Kaylee's friends and family, but none of them had been in contact with her since the previous evening. Everyone insisted that Caitlin wouldn't have just taken off without a word. it was completely out of character for her. She was focused on her final exams, and her birthday was only a few days away, which she planned to celebrate at a local restaurant with her loved ones. With all this information in hand, the police began to suspect that something bad might have happened to Caitlin and decided to launch a search operation. They brought in over 100 volunteers, divided them into groups, and started combing through the city. Her family and friends also prepared flyers with information about Caitlin, which were soon posted on nearly every street. Meanwhile, detectives were looking for any leads that they could find. Naturally, they started by investigating Caitlin's fiancé, John. On the first day, the police noticed some small scratches on his neck, but John explained that he had accidentally scratched himself while shaving. They also asked him to take a voice stress test, which basically analyzes recorded answers for any signs of deception. The results were inconclusive, but the detectives couldn't determine if they indicated that John was lying or simply anxious about his fiancée's disappearance. From the start, he was actively involved in the search efforts, answered all the police's questions, and even gave multiple interviews to local news outlets, which had already begun covering the case. The investigators then verified John's alibi, confirming that he was indeed at a party with friends that night. They were also able to corroborate his account of returning home afterward and watching a movie on his laptop by reviewing the data on his computer. Detectives spoke with the mutual friend who had visited Caitlin and John that evening, and he confirmed that he was indeed at her place. He mentioned that they talked about the couple's upcoming move, Caitlin's exams, and just chatted. However, he did note that Caitlin seemed quieter than usual, spending most of the evening studying on her laptop. He assumed she was simply stressed about the upcoming exams, which were only a few weeks away. Based on this information, the likelihood of John's involvement seemed slim, and investigators shifted their focus to other leads. After obtaining a warrant to track Caitlin's phone, they discovered that it had been turned off at 12:06 a.m., and there had been no activity since. They also saw that she had sent John a photo about half an hour earlier, which aligned with his account. Despite their efforts, no further traces of Caitlin were found, so the police doubled down on the search. In the days that followed, even more volunteers joined the effort, and national media began covering her disappearance. Search teams scoured forests, bodies of water, and abandoned buildings, but nothing yielded any results. Weeks went by, and despite the ongoing search, the police found no trace of Caitlin. John continued to be heavily involved in the search efforts, but as time passed, more and more people in the town started to suspect that he might have had something to do with his fiance's disappearance. Eventually, these rumors reached John himself, and he addressed the accusations, stating that all he wants is to bring Caitlin home and that he didn't have time to focus on such allegations. The investigators also made it clear that they had no solid reasons to suspect John. His alibi checked out. He had allowed them to search his home without a warrant and consistently cooperated with the police on every request, doing everything they'd asked. Still, John admitted that the accusations sometimes frustrated him. Once, while putting up flyers on the street, a woman approached him and started talking about the case. She mentioned that most people thought the boyfriend was probably the one who did it, without realizing she was actually talking to him. The search for Caitlin continued for several months, but eventually the investigators had to call it off. Despite their efforts, they hadn't found a single clue, so the police decided to focus on the investigation and follow up on any new leads. By that time, Caitlin's case had gained national attention, and the detectives had received hundreds of tips. They thoroughly looked into each one, but none brought them any closer to finding the missing young woman. The authorities also kept increasing the reward for information, which reached $50,000 within the first few months. The case remained cold for almost a year, until a rather unexpected twist. Police in Miami arrested a 28-year-old man for assaulting a college student. At first, this seemed unrelated, until detectives working on Caitlin's case discovered that this man had been living right across the street from her apartment complex at the time of her disappearance. Detectives went to Miami to question him and establish his whereabouts on the night Caitlin vanished. But after a thorough investigation, they concluded that he had no opportunity to commit the crime, and he was ruled out as a suspect. This case remained cold for another year, until April 10, 2013. On that day, a man from a small town called Cedar Lake in Indiana went searching for scrap metal along a road near a wooded area. As he walked past some trees, he noticed a bundle of black tarp. He decided to inspect it and, to his horror, discovered human bones inside. He immediately called the police, and the officers sent the remains to a lab for analysis. During the search of that area, they also found another bag, which contained only a skull. The experts quickly determined that the remains were indeed human and, using dental records, identified the victim. It was Caitlin. This confirmed that Caitlin had been dead all along, and the police were now certain they were dealing with a murder, as someone had dismembered her body and transported it to a neighboring state. The killer hadn't even attempted to bury the remains. They had simply been left next to a pile of trash. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, the forensic experts were unable to uncover any significant clues or determine the exact cause of death. The only notable finding was evidence of a stab wound on one of the arm bones. Although the exact cause of death could not be established, the medical examiners confirmed that it was undoubtedly a homicide. The fact that the remains were discovered in another state complicated the investigation. Police from both Indiana and Ohio had to work together, but despite their combined efforts, they made little progress. They did, however, conclude that the body was likely kept elsewhere before being moved to the woods. It's possible the killer feared it would be discovered and decided to relocate the remains to a more remote spot. In 2015, Caitlin's father decided to hire a private investigator because he felt that the local police department was not putting enough effort into solving the case. The investigator conducted his own investigation, speaking with Caitlin's relatives and friends, and eventually identified 2 potential suspects. He passed this information on to the police, but they chose not to disclose the detective's findings. That same year, the reward for information increased to $75,000. Yet this still did not bring investigators any closer to solving the mystery. Caitlin's father fought to have this case transferred from the local police to the county authorities, and by the end of 2015, he finally succeeded. A new team of detectives took over and began working on the case basically from scratch. In 2016, detectives told reporters that they had a prime suspect whom they believed to be responsible for the murder, but they lacked any evidence to make an arrest. Because of this, they did not reveal the suspect's identity, and the investigation stalled once again for years. In 2018, police in a town just a few miles from Caitlin's home discovered the body of another young woman. The circumstances of this crime bore a striking resemblance to Caitlin's case, prompting investigators to explore a possible connection. They soon identified a suspect named Michael, who had reportedly stalked the victim for weeks before killing her. Detectives began to investigate any potential links between Michael and Caitlin, and initially they found none. But soon, they stumbled upon a surprising detail. In one of the killer's social media photos from a music festival, he was seen standing next to Caitlin's fiancé, John. When police questioned John about this, he confirmed that he had met Michael at the festival, but stated that they had barely interacted. Despite the intriguing coincidence, investigators couldn't uncover any further connection between Michael and Caitlin, making it impossible to link him to her murder. This continued until 2023, when investigators unexpectedly announced the first arrest in Caitlin's case. Police took a man named Jonathan into custody. They informed the media that Jonathan was a close friend of both Caitlin and her fiancé. At first, the police kept the details of the arrest under wraps, but 2 months later, they made another shocking move. Caitlin's fiancé John was arrested on suspicion of her murder. Only after this did investigators share with the public what they had uncovered in the past few years. When the case was handed over to the county police, the new detectives started from scratch, going through all the existing evidence. Right away, they found John's behavior suspicious, especially his 911 call. The investigators felt his words sounded rehearsed, almost like he was reading from a script. They got the same vibe from his initial statements to the patrol officer. Next, the detectives looked at recordings of conversations with mutual friends of Caitlin and John. Many of these friends had shared some concerning observations back in 2011. According to their accounts, in the months leading up to her disappearance, Caitlin expressed that there were serious issues in her relationship with John. So serious that she even considered breaking up with him. She told her friends that John had started using drugs, became more aggressive, and was constantly watching adult content of a quite disturbing nature. Another interesting aspect of the case came from witness statements that had been in the police's possession since 2011. On the night Caitlin disappeared, two teenagers snuck out for a party around 2 a.m. As they passed John's mother's house, they noticed two cars pull up with their headlights off. John got out from one of the cars, went inside the house, and quickly returned before getting behind the wheel. Both cars then drove away, still not turning the lights on. These statements contradicted John's alibi, who claimed he had been home watching a movie. But investigators found out that his alibi relied on open tabs on his laptop related to that movie, but there were no concrete proofs confirming he was actually at home watching it. So, it turned out John didn't really have any solid alibi. On the contrary, two witnesses had seen him that night under very suspicious circumstances. But that wasn't all. It turned out that on the night Caitlin disappeared, John's phone had been turned off just 2 minutes before Caitlin's and remained inactive for 15 hours. John also deleted several messages he had sent to his fiancée that evening, leaving their content a mystery. Initially, he claimed that Caitlin hadn't responded to his good morning message, but it was later revealed that he never sent such a message at all. Another interesting detail was neighbors' reports about hearing some noise from Caitlin's apartment that night. According to their initial statement, they heard arguing, banging, and then someone quietly repeating the word, "No." John, on the other hand, insisted there was no argument between them, and the original team of investigators, for some reason, didn't find this odd at all. After reviewing all this information, the detectives concluded that John had been the only serious suspect from the start, but they needed more evidence. They re-interviewed Caitlin's friends, which led to a surprising discovery. One female friend revealed that just a few months after Caitlin's disappearance, John confessed he had romantic feelings for her. This revelation shocked her, especially since John had still been participating in the search efforts for his missing fiancée and expressing how much he missed Caitlin. The detectives also re-interviewed all the witnesses and eventually obtained a search warrant for John's mother's house, where he had been living at the time of the murder. There, they discovered a black tarp identical to the one that had covered Caitlin's remains. In his room, the police found several disturbing poems handwritten by John. One poem contained a troubling inner dialogue. "Deep down, I love her. You have to kill her, but I love her. She has to die." The detectives also discovered that John had been quite aggressive toward his new wife. By that time, he had a family and children, and the police found video footage showing him yelling at his wife while holding their young daughter. Finally, the detectives determined that the location where Caitlin's remains were found was all along the route to John's father's farm, a place he visited frequently. This fact confirmed his familiarity with the area. Putting all this information together, the detectives decided to confront John, but he denied any involvement in the murder. When they pointed out all the suspicious details and inconsistencies, he calmly responded that they were merely circumstantial. Unfortunately for investigators, he was right. They understood that with this limited evidence, they were unlikely to secure a conviction, as there was no solid proof linking him to the crime. However, they could arrest him for providing false statements based on witness accounts that placed him leaving his house at 2 a.m. But there was another complication. Witnesses reported that John wasn't alone. Another car had pulled up with him. Following this lead, detectives focused on his friend Jonathan, suspecting he might be the other person. They soon discovered that Jonathan was also in that group photo from the music festival, alongside John and a convicted murderer who had killed another young woman. Reviewing Jonathan's conversations with the police in light of their findings, the detectives decided to arrest him for providing false statements, although they didn't disclose specific details at the time. 2 months later, they arrested John himself, but the case still hung by a thread due to the lack of substantial evidence. The detectives seemed to hope that Jonathan would give them a confession. At that point, they believed someone had helped the fiancé dispose of the body, and it seemed his friend was involved. But both men continued to deny any connection to the murder, and John posted a $1 million bond, securing his release until the trial. Given all this, the investigators took a desperate step. Realizing that a jury trial would likely lead to John's acquittal, they decided to offer him a deal. The prosecution agreed to reduce the charge of third-degree murder in exchange for a confession, and John accepted the offer. In June 2024, he appeared before a judge and pleaded guilty, but refused to share any details of the incident, as it wasn't required under the terms of the deal. In the end, the judge sentenced him to the maximum possible term for that charge, which in Ohio was only 3 years. This verdict understandably outraged the entire country, but the judge had no power to change it. Had John not accepted the plea deal, he could have easily avoided even that sentence, as there was simply no evidence for first-degree murder charges. As for his friend Jonathan, all charges against him were dropped for the same reasons. It seemed the detectives were unable to find any evidence that he had assisted in disposing of the body. After the sentencing, Caitlin's father expressed that the biggest concern was not knowing the full truth behind his daughter's murder, rather than the actual prison sentence. He admitted that he initially doubted John's guilt, but had gradually shifted toward believing it over the years. He recalled how John had stayed in touch with him and even hugged him at Caitlin's funeral, despite being the one responsible for her death. Shortly after John was placed in prison, his cellmate contacted the police and claimed that John had told him some details about the murder. According to the inmate, there had been an argument between them that night, and John had lost control. He attacked Caitlin and strangled her, then panicked and even thought about calling the police. He also considered staging the scene to make it look like Caitlin had done it herself, but ultimately decided to dispose of her body instead. But the detectives were hesitant to believe this account. They assumed that John might have told this story because it actually aligned with the existing evidence, but whether he was telling the truth was still an open question. The police believed that the murder could have been premeditated rather than an impulsive act of rage. One detective who interrogated John was convinced that the man was a psychopath. He stated that he had spoken to many criminals throughout his career, but John stood out among all of them. Despite all this, there was no way to change the sentence, and John would be released in 2027, when he turned 39. The victim's parents had given up hope of ever learning the full truth. Even if John decided to confess, they would likely struggle to believe him. They were left to watch as he served a minimal sentence behind bars and would eventually return to society, where his actions could potentially harm others. The police are also continuing to investigate a possible connection between John, his friend, and the man convicted of killing another woman. They do not rule out the possibility that the trio could have bonded over their twisted fantasies and shared tendencies toward violence, but there is no evidence to support this theory yet. Holly Lynn Bobo was born on October 12, 1990, in a small American town called Darden, Tennessee. It was a quiet, peaceful place with just a few hundred residents, far away from big cities. Holly lived there with her parents and older brother. The family loved spending time outdoors. They'd go hiking, fishing, and swim in the little creeks around town. Holly also had a passion for singing and often took part in her local church services. After high school, Holly decided to pursue a career in healthcare and become a nurse, so she enrolled in the University of Tennessee's campus in a neighboring town. By 2011, at the age of 20, Holly was dedicating most of her time to her studies. She also had a boyfriend. The couple had been dating since high school, and they were making big plans for their future together. Holly still lived with her parents since her university was only a few minutes' drive away. Plus, her father had built their home himself, and it meant a lot for the family, so Holly wasn't in any rush to move out. On April 13th, Holly woke up around 4:30 a.m. to get ready for class. A few hours later, her parents left for work, while her brother was still asleep. At about 7:30, Holly's boyfriend called her to tell her that he planned to go hunting on a large piece of land owned by Holly's grandmother and wanted to make sure her family wouldn't mind it. They chatted for a few minutes, and Holly said she'd be leaving for university soon. A while later, one of Holly's neighbors stepped outside and was about to get into his car when he heard a piercing scream coming from the direction of her house. Thinking that something might have happened to a neighbor, he told his mother about what just happened, and she called Holly's mom. Holly's mother tried to call her daughter, but Holly didn't pick up. Growing concerned, she decided to head back home to make sure everything was okay. Holly's brother, who was still asleep at the time, hadn't heard the scream, but shortly after, their dog in the backyard started barking loudly. That's when he decided to look out the window to see what was going on. Holly's brother looked out and saw her standing in the garage with a man beside her. He didn't recognize him because the man was wearing camouflage, but his first thought was that it might be Holly's boyfriend. The brother knew about his plans to go hunting on their grandmother's land, and he often wore camouflage. Since the garage was too far from his window, Holly's brother couldn't hear what they were talking about, but he could tell from her tone that she seemed upset. He decided to call his mom and ask if Holly was planning to go to class that day, or if she'd invited her boyfriend over instead. But his mother interrupted him, yelling that the man wasn't her boyfriend. She then said something quite unexpected. She told him to grab a gun and shoot the man immediately. Shocked, he asked if she was serious, and she replied yes before hanging up. When he looked back out the window, he saw Holly walking toward the woods near their property, with the man in camouflage holding her by the hand. This time, he noticed the man was much taller and broader than her boyfriend. At that moment, he was still confused about what was happening. He tried calling Holly, but she didn't answer. He also called her boyfriend, but he didn't pick up either. Meanwhile, their mom had already called the police. But since she was working in a neighboring county, the call was directed to a different police station. Soon after, her son called her back to tell her that Holly had walked into the woods with this man. He then grabbed his gun and went outside, but by then, Holly was nowhere in sight. However, he did notice splatters of blood inside the garage and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the house within minutes, but by that time, there was no trace of Holly. Her brother showed them the blood in the garage and described the strange man he'd seen. Aside from the camouflage, the man was also wearing a cap, so he couldn't get a clear look at his face. Still, he remembered that the man had long, dark hair that reached down to his back. He also mentioned that he couldn't make out what Holly and the man were talking about, but he noticed the man had a fairly deep voice. The whole situation seemed strange to the police, but they didn't rush to start a full investigation. The local police department had very little experience handling cases like this, so they weren't sure what to do. In those critical first hours, they didn't search the woods, secure the house, or the bloodstained garage, or even talk to the neighbors. When Holly's parents returned home, they quickly realized that the officers weren't putting in any real effort to find their daughter. After repeated pleas from the family to begin a proper investigation, officers finally organized a search of the woods, spoke with neighbors, and brought in forensic experts to examine the blood in the garage. They also confirmed that Holly's boyfriend couldn't have been the man she was seen with. Besides the fact that her brother had noted the man looked very different, the police verified that her boyfriend was out hunting at the time of her disappearance. The search in the woods turned up nothing, so investigators requested GPS data from Holly's phone. It showed her moving north for about 30 minutes before heading back in the opposite direction. The last signal came from a spot in the woods, just a few hundred yards from her house. After that, the phone seemed to have been turned off. Police went to search that area and soon found the phone. Its SIM card was removed, but there was no sign of Holly herself. The search continued for several days, but led nowhere. Meanwhile, something strange started happening. People in their small town began finding Holly's belongings scattered around. First, someone found her lunch container on the street, then a receipt with her name on it. Another resident came across her school card. It was all pretty strange, but the police still couldn't figure out who was leaving these items. They considered that it might have been Holly herself, or maybe the person who took her. With no progress in finding Holly, investigators turned to the list of convicted criminals in the area. Soon, their attention shifted to a local man named Terry, who had multiple assault charges on his record. Digging deeper, they found that his victims shared striking similarities with Holly in both age and appearance. Terry also matched the height and build description of the man seen with Holly, so investigators began looking into his possible involvement in her disappearance. They obtained a warrant to search his home, but found no evidence. Next, they set up a wiretap, monitoring his calls and conversations for several weeks, but they still couldn't uncover anything that connected him to Holly's case. The investigators continued looking into other suspects and kept expanding their search area. With each passing week, more and more volunteers joined the effort, but despite their combined efforts, the search operations brought no results. For the next several months, there was barely any progress in Holly's case. Eventually, the police called off the ground search, shifting their focus entirely to investigating potential suspects. But this didn't lead anywhere either. Holly's family was devastated. They had no clue what had happened to her, where she might be, or if she was even alive. They also blamed the local police department, feeling the authorities hadn't put in enough effort, especially in those crucial first days. Looking back, the family realized the police had taken almost no action in the first 72 hours, which are often critical in missing persons cases. Despite their frustration, complaints, and constant push for a more active investigation, Holly's fate remained unknown. This went on for 3 years, until something unexpected happened. In March 2014, police arrested a local man named Dylan, known to authorities for his involvement with illegal substances, on charges of unlawful weapon possession. During his interrogation, he made an unexpected confession, claiming he had seen Holly after she was abducted. According to Dylan, on the day of Holly's disappearance, he had gone to his brother Zach's house to pick up a car. When he entered the living room, he saw his brother, their mutual friend Jason, and another person, Holly. She was sitting in a chair, looking terrified. Dylan claimed that Zach told him he had kidnapped Holly, assaulted her, and even filmed it. As for what happened afterward, Dylan said only that she was killed soon after the abduction, insisting he had no part in the murder. He also mentioned that his brother had been wearing camouflage that day. The police brought Zach and Jason in for questioning, but both denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance. Investigators also searched their homes for any evidence or the alleged video of Holly's assault, but found nothing. Shortly after this, a woman contacted the police with another unexpected story. She claimed that she had previously lived with a man named Jeffrey, and one day he had shown her a clip from a video where a man assaulted a young woman. Jeffrey told her that the woman in the video was Holly, and that the man doing that was Zach. He also mentioned that the video had been recorded by his brother, Mark. Detectives met with this woman and asked if she'd be willing to call Jeffrey while they recorded the conversation. She agreed, and during the call, she brought up the video. From Jeffrey's responses, detectives felt certain he really had shown her the recording. Shortly after, Jeffrey and his brother were both arrested. During questioning, both denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance and claimed not to know anything about the video. When detectives played Jeffrey the recording of his conversation with the woman, he said he had probably misunderstood her question. He added that his ex-wife's name was also Holly, suggesting he might have misinterpreted what she meant. The police searched the brothers' homes and examined all their devices, but were unable to find the video. They also found no evidence linking the brothers to the other 3 suspects. In the end, they had to release the brothers, as the witness's statement alone was not enough. However, as investigators continued trying to establish connections between these people and Zach, they uncovered another suspect. They found that a man named Shane had been in contact with Zach on the day of Holly's disappearance and decided to question him. They suspected that Zach might have asked him for help in disposing of the body. And during the interrogation, Shane confirmed that he indeed knew where Holly's remains were hidden. Detectives offered him full immunity in exchange for testifying against others involved and leading them to the body. Shane agreed, but for some reason, he was ultimately unable to locate Holly's remains. In the end, the investigators revoked the deal and began considering other ways to obtain confessions or some new evidence against these suspects. While investigators were pursuing this lead, they received an unexpected call. In September 2014, a group of men went hunting in a forest about 19 miles from Holly's home. One of them spotted a large bucket hidden in the brush and decided to take a look. When he turned it over, he found a human skull and immediately reported it to the police. Forensic experts arrived on the scene and collected partial remains, which they sent to the lab for identification. Right away, detectives suspected these might be Holly's, and dental records quickly confirmed it. The remains had been out in the woods for 3 years, so finding out exactly what happened was nearly impossible. But one thing was certain: a bullet hole in the skull confirmed she'd been shot. Now, there was no question, Holly's death was a homicide. With the case now officially classified as a murder, detectives zeroed in on their 4 main suspects: Zach, his brother Dylan, their friend Jason, and their acquaintance Shane. The detectives decided to focus on Jason and brought him in for questioning. At first, he kept denying any involvement, but when the police told him that he could face a life sentence for murder, Jason agreed to testify against Zach. According to Jason, on the day of Holly's disappearance, he went over to Zach's house to buy drugs. Along with Zach, his brother and Shane were also there. They told him they had killed Holly and now needed to get rid of the evidence. Zach then showed him Holly's body, wrapped in a blanket, lying in the trunk of his car. Zach asked Jason to help dispose of the body, and he agreed. While Shane burned Holly's belongings in a barrel, he and Zach drove to the Tennessee River Bridge to throw her into the water. But when they pulled her out of the trunk, Zach realized she was still alive and shot her. Fearing the gunshot might attract attention, Zach quickly changed his plan. He put Holly's body back in the car and drove off to find another hiding place, dropping Jason off along the way. Sometime later, when Zach reached out to Jason, he mentioned he'd hidden Holly's body in the woods, but as it turned out, the location he described wasn't where her remains were actually found. Jason's story about the abduction also raised some questions. According to him, Zach, his brother, and Shane initially went to Holly's brother's house to teach him how to produce illegal substances. There, they saw Holly and apparently mentioned their plans to her. She became outraged, yelling at them to leave. Worried she'd exposed their illegal activities, the trio decided to abduct her. This version seemed odd for several reasons. First, Holly's brother claimed he had never been interested in making illegal substances and had never discussed it with any of the suspects. Second, when he woke up, he saw only one person with his sister, and that person didn't match Zach's description. The only one fitting what he remembered was Shane. Where the other two suspects were at that moment remained unclear. Jason also revealed that after abducting Holly, the three men took her to an old barn belonging to Shane's grandmother, where they assaulted her. It's worth mentioning that the check with Holly's name on it and her school card were found less than 100 yards from Shane's house. As for Zach and his brother, the police managed to find several pieces of circumstantial evidence linking them to the crime. Right after Holly's abduction, multiple neighbors reported seeing a white pickup speeding away from her house, and Zach owned a similar truck. His vehicle was also spotted by a surveillance camera near her home. Zach's ex-girlfriend told investigators that he had occasionally threatened her, saying something like, "I'll tie you up like Holly, and no one will ever see you again." Several other witnesses claimed that he had told them, directly or indirectly, about his involvement in Holly's disappearance. Police also learned that Zach had threatened his brother, warning him that he'd end up in the same hole next to her if he cooperated with the investigation. Detectives also learned from a local resident that after the murder, Shane and Zach offered him a gun in exchange for illegal substances, and he accepted the deal. He later threw the weapon into the water, where police eventually recovered it. However, there were no fingerprints or DNA on it, so experts couldn't link it to the crime. As the prosecution prepared for trial, gathering all the evidence, the case took yet another unexpected turn. Shane, who had initially agreed to cooperate with the police, but then failed to lead them to Holly's remains, was found dead in a hotel room. Authorities concluded he had done it himself, though the exact reason remained unknown. His lawyer blamed the investigators, insisting they had threatened Shane with a long prison sentence. The suspects' trials were held separately, starting with Zach's. His trial began in September 2017, 6 years after Holly's murder. Though Zach pled not guilty, Jason's testimony, along with other pieces of circumstantial evidence, weighed heavily against him. After a few weeks, the jury found him guilty of murder, sentencing him to life in prison, along with 2 additional 25-year terms for kidnapping and assault. In January the following year, Dylan went to trial. He decided to take a plea deal, admitting to helping with the kidnapping and murder, though the deal didn't require him to testify against anyone else or provide any specific details. He was sentenced to 35 years with no chance of parole. As for Jason, due to his cooperation, he received an 8-year sentence with the opportunity for early release. So, Holly's case was officially closed, but even after that, many questions remained. The prosecution lacked a single solid piece of evidence directly linking the suspects to her kidnapping. No fingerprints, DNA, or other evidence was ever found that Holly had been in Zach's car or home. The suspects' families and defense insisted that the entire case was built on a fabrication. They claimed police first coerced Dylan into making a false statement and later did the same with Jason, threatening him with prison time if he refused. Dylan and Jason's stories also didn't fully align. Initially, Dylan claimed he had gone to his brother's house that day to pick up a car and saw Holly and Jason there, but Jason stated he arrived after they'd already put Holly's body in the trunk and even alleged that Dylan had been directly involved in the abduction. There was also another questionable detail. According to investigators, the person who led Holly into the woods was likely Shane, as he was the only one whose height and build matched her brother's description. However, Shane had short, light hair, while Holly's brother recalled seeing a man with long, dark hair. A former Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officer, who worked on the case in its early stages, shared a few more curious insights. He mentioned that they requested cell tower data to track the location of each suspect's phone, but none of them appeared to be near Holly's house. However, since cell tower data only provides a rough estimate within a relatively large area, it wasn't definitive. The investigators also revealed that they found a palm print on Holly's car that didn't match hers, her family's, or any of her friends. They compared it to all the suspects as well, but none of them matched either. Yet, there was no certainty that this print was even relevant to the case. Zach's attorney argued that a much more likely suspect was a man named Terry, whom police investigated during the initial months. As we recall, they questioned him, searched his house, and even placed a wiretap on him, but found no evidence to confirm his involvement. Terry's wife claimed she was home with him that morning while he was installing a new bathtub, but the defense attorney argued that her alibi might have been inaccurate. He said that she was actually at work that morning and that Terry had called her there. When investigators checked with the store where he supposedly bought the tub, they couldn't confirm the sale. Adding to suspicions, right after Holly's disappearance, Terry cut off his long, dark hair. According to the attorney, not only could Terry's wife have faked an alibi for him, but she might have even helped him commit his crimes. Terry had several convictions for assaults on other women, and in some cases, his wife allegedly helped him. Lastly, forensic experts couldn't completely rule out a match between Terry's palm print and the one found on Holly's car. While they could confidently rule out everyone else, they couldn't do the same for Terry. Despite all of this, the prosecution remained firm, insisting that the suspect's guilt was proven beyond doubt, with too many circumstantial factors pointing to their involvement. Jason served only 3 years before being released early, but just a few months later, he was arrested again on weapons charges, putting him back behind bars to await trial. Then, at the beginning of 2024, Jason made an unexpected statement. He claimed that his previous testimony had been fabricated, and he never actually saw Holly that day. According to him, he made up the whole story to avoid a life sentence, striking a deal with the police based on lies. Following this, Zach filed a motion for a new trial, but in late September 2024, it was denied. The judge ruled that Jason's statements alone were insufficient to overturn the case, as there were still other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Zach. It's worth noting that at the time Jason recanted his testimony, he was still awaiting trial for his weapons charges. About a month before the judge ruled on Zach's appeal, Jason was sentenced to 19 years in prison. This timing raises questions about his motives. His sudden reversal might have been an attempt to influence his own case and potentially lessen his sentence. As it stands, all 3 men are still in prison, and the only real shot at a retrial depends on whether their lawyers can find new evidence that either clears their names or points the finger at someone else. So far though, there's been no progress on that front, and the prosecution insists that all 3 are clearly guilty. Jersey Bridgman was born on November 14, 2006, in the small town of Bentonville, Arkansas. When she was 3, her parents welcomed another daughter, but soon after, they decided to get a divorce. Even after the split, Jersey still spent a lot of time with her dad. He eventually remarried and had 2 more girls with his new wife. Since he lived just a short drive away in a nearby town, Jersey would often stay over at their place for a few days before going back to her mom. In 2012, when Jersey was 5, she and her mom moved to a new house in the same town. Jersey and her sister quickly made friends with the neighborhood kids. and her mom's best friend lived only a few yards away. Their families were so close they felt almost like one big extended family, and they spent a lot of time together. On November 19, 2012, less than a week after Jersey's birthday, her mom went to work her usual evening shift at the local supermarket. On nights like this, if her parents weren't available to watch the girls, Jersey's mom would sometimes leave them with her best friend. She didn't mind looking after them, especially since her own kids were friends with Jersey and her sister. That night, Jersey's mom finished her shift around 11:30 p.m., picked up the girls, and took them home to bed. Jersey fell asleep right away, but her younger sister wanted to sleep with her mom, so she took the girl along to her own room. The next morning, Jersey's mom woke up around 6:30 a.m. and went to get her daughter ready for school. But Jersey wasn't in her bedroom. The woman began searching the entire house and realized Jersey was nowhere to be found. Panicking, she called her own mother, telling her she couldn't find Jersey. Her mom suggested that maybe Jersey was playing hide and seek somewhere and told her to check closets and any other places she might fit in. Jersey's mom searched every corner of the house once again, but couldn't find her. She looked outside and saw her friend sitting on her front porch. Hoping Jersey might have woken up early and gone over to her house to play, the mother asked if she'd seen her. Since Jersey spent a lot of time at their place, it seemed possible. But her friend hadn't seen Jersey and immediately started helping with the search. They checked around the neighborhood, and her friend also looked inside her own house, but there was still no sign of Jersey. At this point, Jersey's mom was in full panic mode and decided to call the police immediately. Officers arrived within minutes and began their own search. They checked the house thoroughly to confirm Jersey wasn't there, then got permission from her friend to look through her house as well. Meanwhile, other officers started searching the nearby streets in case Jersey had somehow wandered off. During the search, they noticed a small vacant house next to Jersey's mother's property. The officers decided to check it, mainly because one of the doors was slightly open. After confirming that no one lived there, they quickly requested a search warrant. Investigators considered the possibility that Jersey might have gone inside, and the judge promptly granted them permission to enter the property. The officers searched each room, but found no sign of Jersey, until one of them decided to check a closet in the bedroom. What he found was truly horrifying. Inside was Jersey's body, and it only took one look to realize she was no longer alive. Her clothes were missing, and from what they could see, it appeared that the cause of death was strangulation. The body was handed over to medical examiners, and the police began their investigation. When they spoke with Jersey's mom, she mentioned that she left one of the front doors unlocked that night. She explained that she often did this because her boyfriend also worked night shifts and sometimes came by afterward to stay at her place. Since he didn't have a key, leaving the door unlocked meant he wouldn't have to wake her up. She added that he hadn't come over that night, and police immediately began considering him as a potential suspect. Since someone had taken Jersey to the abandoned house, it was likely she knew and trusted this person. Her mom's boyfriend got along well with Jersey and her younger sister. Whenever he was around, he spent a lot of time playing with the girls, and they both trusted him. While investigators looked into his whereabouts that night, they uncovered something else. About a year earlier, Jersey's biological father had faced some serious charges. In December 2011, Jersey was spending time at her father's house with his new wife. During her stay, a friend of the family was visiting, and one day, this person heard a child crying from behind a closed door. Curious and concerned, she opened the bedroom door to check what was going on. What she saw was truly shocking. Jersey was sitting there with a dog collar around her leg, tied to a dresser. The room was a mess, cluttered with dirty clothes and other stuff. Horrified, she freed Jersey and immediately reported what she'd seen to the police. Officers quickly arrested Jersey's father and his wife. During questioning, they claimed they'd been tying Jersey up at night for her own safety, saying she'd sometimes sleepwalk and tried to grab some medications or even leave the house in the middle of the night. When asked why they didn't just use child gates, Jersey's father simply replied that they couldn't afford them. However, as the investigation continued, police found out that her father had been using drugs and somehow had enough money to buy them. He also wasn't working, despite the fact that he and his wife were raising 2 other children. Investigators spoke with Jersey, and she revealed the real reason they'd started tying her to the dresser. One night, she had gone into the kitchen and taken a few pieces of pie and some other snacks without permission. To punish the girl, her father and stepmother decided to tie her up. Jersey also told that sometimes she was forced to sleep on the floor in the bedroom without even being allowed to use the bathroom. In the end, Jersey's father was sentenced to 18 years, and his wife received 12 years behind bars. Since then, Jersey had been living with her mother, who had no idea about all of this, as Jersey had been too afraid to tell anyone. This story, for obvious reasons, caught the detectives' attention, but they quickly established that Jersey's father couldn't have been involved, as he had been in prison since his arrest and would not have been able to be at his daughter's home that night. Investigators then turned their attention to all known sex offenders living within a few miles. Each one provided an alibi, leading the police to focus on people in Jersey's close circle. Around this time, the medical examiners completed a preliminary report confirming that the cause of death was strangulation. They also found evidence of SA and collected a biological material from the perpetrator. This sample was sent to the lab for DNA analysis, while detectives turned their attention to Jersey's mother's boyfriend. He claimed that he'd been working at a store that night, and his shift didn't end until early in the morning. Police reviewed the store's CCTV footage, which backed up his claim. However, there was one problem. Detectives found that he had a break during his shift. Theoretically, he could have committed the crime, as the store was only a few minutes away from Jersey's home. But his co-workers told the police that he hadn't left the store during his break, so detectives eventually ruled him out as a suspect. While speaking with the police, the boyfriend mentioned an interesting detail. Around 3 a.m., a man named Zachary, Jersey's mother's neighbor and the husband of her best friend, had come into the store. Zachary said he had stomach pains, bought some medicine, and left. Given that the crime seemed to have been committed around this time, police found this account quite suspicious. They had already spoken to Zachary and his wife, and had searched their home, but didn't find any evidence. Initially, Zachary hadn't raised any suspicions, but with this new information about his late-night trip, detectives decided to question him again. Zachary confirmed that he did wake up in the middle of the night with stomach pain. Not finding any medication at home, he headed to a store just a few hundred yards away. When he got back, he eventually fell asleep again and woke up around 6:30 a.m. to get his older son ready for school. He also willingly provided police with his fingerprints, a DNA sample, and the clothes he wore to the store that night. Zachary insisted he would never harm Jersey, and the detectives believed he was telling the truth. While awaiting the DNA test results, the police decided to dig deeper into Zachary's background and uncovered a few intriguing details. First, they found that he had an extensive criminal record, though it was mainly for non-violent, relatively minor offenses. Zachary also had a troubled past. Police learned that he had suffered various forms of abuse over the years from his family members, including his stepfather, biological mother, and brother. 13 reports had been filed by concerned people who noticed the abuse and wanted to help, but it's unclear if the police ever took action. Detectives then spoke with Jersey's mother to learn more about Zachary. She shared that he and his wife often helped look after the kids, and he got along great with them. Jersey and her sister even called him Uncle Zach. He was practically family. The girls visited his house almost daily. The mother also mentioned that both Zachary and his wife had keys to her home. Since Jersey seemed to trust Zachary completely and would have followed him anywhere without question, detectives began to consider he might be involved. They also grew suspicious of his late-night store visit, thinking it could have been a calculated move to create an alibi with witnesses and CCTV footage. When detectives brought Zachary in for another interview, he suddenly said he wouldn't talk without his lawyer. This shift caught investigators off guard, especially since he'd been fully cooperative just recently, doing everything they'd asked. With no solid evidence against Zachary, all the investigators could do was wait for the DNA test results and keep searching for new leads. But then, out of nowhere, came an unexpected twist. Despite his initial refusal, Zachary called the police, saying he was now willing to take a polygraph test to clear his name. Detectives immediately set everything up, but the results weren't in Zachary's favor. The polygraph operator determined that many of his responses showed signs of deception. This only deepened detectives' suspicions, but they still needed concrete evidence. They also discovered that Zachary's decision to take the polygraph test was prompted by his wife, who had apparently started to doubt his honesty. It turned out she warned him that if he refused to cooperate with the police, she would take the children and leave him. So, this sudden change wasn't really about Zachary trying to clear his name after all. Soon after failing the polygraph, Zachary took another suspicious step. He posted on social media saying he had made a huge mistake that would ruin his life. To detectives, this seemed like further confirmation of his guilt, yet they still needed some solid proof to move forward. The lab results came back on November 26, 6 days after the murder. This was also the day of Jersey's funeral, and Zachary, along with his wife, planned to attend it. Forensic experts had extracted a DNA profile from the biological material found on the victim's body and analyzed all of Zachary's clothing. The results didn't surprise detectives. Nearly all of Zachary's clothes contained traces of Jersey's DNA, and the biological material on her body matched his DNA as well. With this crucial evidence, detectives obtained a warrant for his arrest and detained him right outside the church, just as the ceremony was about to begin. During the interrogation, Zachary continued to deny his involvement, saying he had nothing to do with it. But when detectives told him about the lab results, he ultimately confessed to the crime. According to his story, Zachary really did wake up with a stomachache that night and went looking for medicine, but couldn't find any at home. So, he decided to drop by Jersey's mom's place. For him and his wife, this wasn't unusual. They would often stop by to borrow medicine from her cabinet. Besides, Zachary knew she usually left one of the doors unlocked, so he wouldn't even need to wake her up. Once inside, he noticed that Jersey's bedroom door was slightly open and decided to go in. According to Zachary, he had no clear motive and insisted he didn't understand why he went in there. He woke Jersey up and asked her to come with him. Trusting him like family, Jersey didn't hesitate and followed. Zachary led her to an abandoned house nearby, where he committed his monstrous crime and left her body in a closet. Afterward, he walked to a store, bought some stomach medicine, and went home, where he was able to fall asleep without a care. The next morning, he joined the search for Jersey as if nothing had happened, pretending he was just worried and eager to help find her. Zachary also claimed he hadn't planned the crime and said it all happened on impulse, though detectives had doubts about that. Still, they had no reason to question the rest of his confession. He provided many highly accurate details that hadn't been made public. At that point, the police had kept almost all information under wraps, even from Jersey's mother, so there was no way Zachary could have known those specifics otherwise. In the end, he was charged with murder and held in jail awaiting trial. The prosecution announced they would seek the death penalty. As for his attorney, he didn't even try to argue Zachary's innocence. Given the confession and overwhelming evidence, it seemed like a lost cause. Instead, his focus was on getting a life sentence instead of the death penalty. It's worth mentioning that soon after Zachary was put in jail, another inmate attacked him. He wasn't seriously injured though, and since then, he's been under increased protection. The trial began in the spring of 2015, 2.5 years after the murder. Since Zachary never recanted his confession, the proceedings moved very quickly. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, with 2 additional life sentences and an extra 20 years. Before the sentencing, Zachary spoke to Jersey's family, expressing deep regret for what he'd done and hoping they might one day forgive him. However, his apology didn't seem to have much effect on them. As is often happens, executions are almost always delayed for many years, and Zachary's case was no exception. He made several attempts to appeal his sentence, initially claiming that his first lawyer hadn't even tried to exclude certain pieces of evidence and that the jury selection process had been flawed. His new attorney also argued that Zachary suffered from severe mental health issues and developmental delays. They claimed his mental capacity was equivalent to that of an 8-year-old, meaning he shouldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. Interestingly, even Zachary's own mother, who had mistreated him for years, came forward in his defense. In an interview, she said she still loved her son and hoped his lawyers could overturn his sentence. Zachary's wife, who was also the best friend of Jersey's mother, supported his appeal as well, even though she had previously condemned his actions. But despite these efforts, the appeal was denied. Independent experts concluded that, while Zachary did show developmental challenges, he was fully capable of understanding his actions and knew he was committing a serious crime. Currently, Zachary remains in prison, still trying to appeal his sentence. The last developments in his case were in early 2024, but his lawyers have yet to convince the court to overturn the death penalty, and it seems unlikely that the situation will ever change. As for Jersey's mother, she eventually married the man she was dating at the time of the tragedy, and they had a daughter together. She regrets that this little girl will never get to know Jersey or experience what a wonderful older sister she could have been. Summer Cook was born on December 31, 1985, in the small town of Logan, Ohio. She grew up in a large family with deeply religious parents. From a young age, Summer and her siblings spent a lot of time at the local church, and their family was well known in the community. She was an outgoing, honest person who had no trouble making friends. Summer got along with everyone and was known for her friendly nature. In school, she stayed busy with ballet, played in the jazz band, and participated in theatrical performances. During her high school years, Summer met a boy named William through their church. They lived on the same street, but before that, they didn't know each other very well. The two started dating, and before long, they decided to get married. Over the next few years, Summer and William had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The family settled close to William's parents, who helped out with the kids almost every day. William's father was a pastor and also ran a small construction business. At one point, the entire family decided to move to Florida after he landed a construction contract there. However, things didn't go as planned, and a few years later, they moved back to Logan. In 2010, Summer decided to divorce William. She got custody of the kids and moved back in with her parents. Since her parents lived on the same street, William and his family were still able to see the children regularly. By the spring of 2011, 25-year-old Summer was dedicating nearly all her time to raising her 3 children, who were 5, 3, and 2 years old at the time. Because of this, she couldn't take on a full-time job, so she worked part-time as a cleaner at a local bank, just a few minutes' drive from her home. Despite her busy schedule, Summer had plans for the future. She wanted to enroll in college to get an education and eventually find a better-paying job. Around this time, she also started dating a man named Adam, who worked as a handyman. On the evening of March 22nd, Summer went to her usual night shift at the bank, which was scheduled to end around 11:20 p.m. Before heading home, she sent a few messages to her boyfriend, Adam, but suddenly stopped responding in the middle of their conversation. At first, Adam thought she might just be busy or running late at work. A bit later, he tried calling her, but Summer didn't answer. Growing concerned, Adam decided to walk over to the bank to check if everything was okay. When he arrived, the first thing Adam noticed was that his car, the one Summer had been using to get to work, was still parked outside. Since her shift had ended almost half an hour ago, he started to feel even more concerned. It was unusual because Summer had always left work at the same time without any delays. He went around to the back door of the bank, which she always used during her shifts, and noticed something behind the dumpster. Lying on the ground were her iPod, car keys, and the battery from her phone. This seemed incredibly suspicious, so Adam immediately called her parents. They confirmed that Summer still hadn't returned home and rushed to the bank. After verifying that the items on the ground did belong to her, they immediately called the police. But to their surprise, her parents quickly learned that they weren't the first ones who contacted the authorities. Just half an hour before they called the police, there had been another report. 2 women who were out for an evening jog had run past the bank and witnessed something horrifying. They saw 2 people in black ski masks grab a woman and force her into a car. The woman struggled and tried to fight back, but she couldn't escape. At the same time, another witness was nearby and he attempted to save her. However, as he approached, a woman stepped out of the car and pepper sprayed him. She then got back into the driver's seat and sped off with the kidnappers and their victim. The 2 joggers immediately ran to the police station, which was only a few blocks away, and reported what they had seen. But instead of springing into action, the officers responded with surprising skepticism. They genuinely thought the women had made the whole thing up, despite their pleas to go and find the abducted person. When the witnesses pressed them to go to the bank and investigate, the officers brushed it off, saying most of their staff were busy conducting traffic stops. Eventually, the women walked to one of their houses, got a car, and drove back to the bank about 20 minutes later. To their surprise, there still wasn't a single police officer at the scene, so they just decided to stay and wait. The officers didn't arrive until nearly an hour later, and even then, they showed little urgency, as if nothing serious had happened. When the husband of one of the women started losing his patience and demanded that they do their job, the police responded with hostility and acted aggressively. Eventually, the officers took action. They determined that the woman who had likely been abducted was Summer. Witnesses also provided a description of the vehicle, a white sedan, that the kidnappers had used to flee the scene. The police issued an alert for the car and then went to talk to Summer's relatives to see if they had any idea who might have wanted to hurt their daughter. Summer's parents told investigators that her relationship with her ex-husband William had been rocky for years, even after the divorce. Summer had told them that William's behavior took a drastic turn right after they got married. He saw himself as deeply religious and demanded complete obedience from her. He controlled who she could talk to and spend time with, expected dinner on the table when he got home, and insisted the house be spotless. He even wouldn't let her go to bed without his permission. On top of this, William actually wanted to take a second wife. Although polygamy was illegal, he believed it was acceptable from a religious standpoint and openly shared his plans with Summer. He browsed websites specifically for women interested in such relationships and was actively searching for someone. At the same time, he told Summer she needed to give him 9 more children on top of the 3 they already had. Besides that, William became increasingly aggressive. He wouldn't let Summer leave the house without him, took away her keys and phone, and tried to control her every move. Eventually, she had enough and decided to file for divorce. But William, as well as his parents, were furious about her decision. He tried to gain full custody of their kids and threatened Summer, saying he'd harm her if she took them away from him. Things got even worse when William found out that Summer was seeing someone new. He already knew Adam, and one day he came across a photo on Adam's social media of him with Summer and the kids. That set him off. William started threatening her again and kept fighting for custody in court, but his threats backfired. After hearing about all of this, the judge sided with Summer and gave her full custody of the kids. William's parents weren't ready to let it go either. They tried to discredit Adam by flooding the police with false claims that he was mistreating the kids. Investigators couldn't find any evidence to support these accusations, but William's parents kept pushing, desperate to regain custody of their grandchildren. Digging deeper, the police uncovered something else. About a year earlier, William's father had started his own church and launched a non-profit organization aimed at helping the homeless and those who had lost their homes. His plan sounded noble. He wanted to build affordable housing for these people. To fund the construction, he began selling lottery tickets and managed to raise several $100,000. But there was a catch. No houses were ever built, and none of the people who bought tickets got their money back. To make things even worse, William's father never gave any explanation about what happened to all the money he'd taken. Around the same time, he lost his license as a priest. While the exact reasons weren't made public, it only added to the questions surrounding him. And just months before Summer disappeared, the family faced yet another blow. They lost their home and were evicted. While the family was still living in their old house, Summer went there to collect the rest of her belongings. She brought Adam along to help load everything into her car and also asked the police to send an officer. She was worried about how her ex-husband's family might react, and her concerns turned out to be justified. William's father immediately became aggressive, demanding that Adam stay off his property. Even with a police officer present, he threatened to shoot and beat Adam. When the officer stepped in to calm things down, William's father lost it and even tried to tackle the officer. That didn't end well. He was arrested and later given a suspended sentence. Investigators also uncovered some unsettling details about William's parents. After William was born, his mother couldn't have more children, which was a devastating blow for her. She became so attached to her grandchildren that she treated them like her own kids. In fact, she even told people that if anything ever happened to William and Summer, she'd take full custody of the children. Summer's parents gave investigators her personal journal, and its contents were heartbreaking. She wrote about how William controlled every part of her life and how his behavior had become more and more aggressive. Summer described feeling like a prisoner in her own home, unable to do anything without his approval. The constant pressure weighed heavily on her, and she often felt like she was living in a nightmare, not reality. After gathering all of this information, the police decided to visit William and his parents, who all lived in the same house. They also discovered that the family owned a car matching the model and color described by witnesses of Summer's abduction. Investigators arrived at their home the day after Summer's disappearance. William claimed that he and his parents had been in town that night. According to him, they had driven to Cleveland, about 3 hours away, to look at some houses. He added that their car broke down during the trip, forcing them to spend the entire night there, and his parents backed up his story. William claimed he hadn't seen his ex-wife in days, not since he dropped off the kids. But the police weren't just going to take his word for it. They got a search warrant for his house and car, hoping to find something that would disprove his alibi. During the search, investigators found a GPS navigator for a car inside the family's home. After extracting the data, they noticed something odd. The device had been turned off at 5:30 p.m. on the day of Summer's abduction, and wasn't turned back on until 7:30 a.m. the next morning. What was odd, though, was that the last location recorded before it was turned off wasn't Cleveland, where the family said they'd been looking at houses, but Logan. As for the next morning, the GPS showed that the family arrived at a car wash at 7:30 a.m. The police got their hands on the CCTV footage, which showed all three of them carefully cleaning the car, inside and out, and even changing the tires. By the time investigators had pieced everything together, 8 days had already gone by. They kept searching for Summer around the city and the nearby areas, interviewing people and following up on leads, but nothing seemed to bring them any closer to finding her. Once investigators confirmed that William and his parents had lied about their alibi, they brought all three in for questioning. William and his father denied any involvement in Summer's disappearance, so the detectives shifted their focus to his mother. To their surprise, she confessed almost immediately, claiming that Summer was already dead, and began providing details about what had happened. According to her, the family was furious about the court's decision to grant Summer full custody of the children. They had been trying to convince her to let them spend more time with the kids, but after William's threats and his increasingly aggressive behavior, Summer was too scared to leave her children with them for long. So, the family came up with a plan. They decided to scare Summer into reconsidering the custody arrangement. Their idea was to abduct and intimidate her, then force her to agree to their terms before letting her go. But things went horribly wrong. After William and his father forced her into the car using a stun gun, William tied her hands with plastic zip ties. Then, he took another one and placed it around her neck. When they realized she was struggling to breathe, they tried to remove it, but none of them had a knife to cut it off. As a result, Summer died, and the family knew they had to get rid of her body. They drove to a nearby town where William's parents regularly attended church. Near the church was a large underground septic tank. Thinking it would be the perfect hiding spot, they dumped her body inside and drove away. Although the woman insisted they never planned to kill Summer, her story seemed highly questionable. Given William's repeated death threats and his father's aggressive behavior toward anyone who restricted his access to the grandchildren, investigators suspected that murder might have been their plan from the start. Police went to the church and discovered Summer's body inside the septic tank. Soon after, medical examiners confirmed that the cause of death aligned with the mother's account, and all three family members were arrested and charged with murder. For Summer's family, the entire ordeal was a devastating blow. Not only had her three children lost their mother, but the police's actions, or lack thereof, raised serious questions and outrage. As we know, the police were alerted to the abduction just minutes after it happened, yet they failed to act for over an hour. Medical experts later confirmed that Summer died about 45 minutes after being kidnapped, meaning there was, potentially, enough time to save her. The police could have immediately began looking for the vehicle based on pretty detailed witness descriptions. Considering the abduction happened in the evening in a small town with almost no traffic, investigators might have had a chance to intercept William and his parents. Instead, they justified their delay by saying that most of their officers were tied up with something else. What angered the public even more was that the police station was just a few hundred yards from the bank where the abduction took place. It would have taken just minutes to get there, even on foot. Yet, despite the witnesses, no one came to Summers' aid. Another troubling part of the case was the plea deal offered to William's mother. In exchange for confessing and revealing the location of Summers' body, she got a much lighter sentence. She also testified in court, sticking to her story, and was sentenced to just 15 years in prison. This means she could be out in just a few years. As for William and his father, both were sentenced to life in prison. Since Summers' death, her children have been living with her parents. For the first 6 months after the murder, they struggled with how to break the devastating news to the kids, that they would never see their mom or dad again. The children kept asking when they would see their mom, as well as their paternal grandparents. Eventually, Summers' parents realized they couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. With the help of a child psychologist, they gradually explained what had happened. At the time, they feared their oldest son might hear the truth from his classmates, as the story had become well known throughout Logan. In fact, strangers would occasionally approach the children on the street to express their condolences. This even led Summers' parents to consider changing the children's last names to shield them from being forever linked to the tragedy. As of today, Summers' children have grown up, and the family stays out of the public eye. As for William's mother, she's set to be released in 2028. It's unclear whether she'll be legally banned from contacting her grandchildren, but given everything we know about this case, it's possible she may try to reconnect with them. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.